Being and Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre, first published in 1943, is one of the most significant works of existential philosophy. In this dense and complex text, Sartre explores the nature of human existence, consciousness, and freedom. He examines the concept of being for itself, conscious beings, and being in itself, objects without consciousness, to analyze how individuals construct meaning in a world without inherent purpose. Central to the book is Sartre's idea of radical freedom, the notion that humans are entirely responsible for defining themselves through their choices, with no predetermined essence or divine blueprint guiding their lives. The book also delves into themes of self-deception, bad faith, relationships with others, and the fundamental experience of nothingness that underlies consciousness. Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980, was a French philosopher, novelist, playwright, and political activist, widely recognized as one of the leading figures of existentialism and 20th century philosophy. Deeply influenced by phenomenology, particularly the works of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, Sartre sought to understand the human condition in a world devoid of inherent meaning. Beyond philosophy, he was an influential writer and public intellectual, producing plays, novels, and essays that explored freedom, authenticity, and the complexities of human relationships. Sartre was also politically active, engaging with Marxist thought and advocating for social justice, individual liberty, and anti-colonial movements. His ideas left a profound mark on existentialism, literature, psychology, and modern thought. Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness opens by setting the foundation for his philosophy of existentialism, focusing on the concepts of being and consciousness. Drawing heavily from phenomenology, Sartre argues that understanding existence requires us to examine consciousness directly, without relying on preconceived ideas or metaphysical systems. At its core, the book seeks to explain what it means to be human, how we experience the world, and why freedom and choice are central to our existence. Sartre distinguishes between two fundamental modes of being in itself and being for itself, concepts that serve as the backbone of his philosophical framework. Being in itself refers to the mode of existence of objects or things that simply are. These entities exist fully and completely, without self-awareness or the ability to change themselves. A rock, for instance, is purely being in itself. It is complete, solid, and fixed in its nature. It has no consciousness, no capacity to reflect on its own existence, and no freedom to alter what it is. Being in itself just exists as a fact in a brute and indifferent manner, without question or possibility of transformation. Sartre describes it as full positivity, meaning it contains no lack or gap. It simply is what it is. Being for itself, on the other hand, is the mode of existence unique to conscious beings. Humans, unlike objects, have the ability to reflect on their existence, question it, and imagine possibilities beyond the present moment. Consciousness is never fully self-contained. It is always directed towards something, a concept Sartre calls intentionality. We are never just being. We are always engaged with the world, defining ourselves through choices and actions. Unlike being in itself, being for itself is marked by a fundamental incompleteness, a sense of lack or nothingness, because we are never fully determined or fixed in nature. We are not born with a predefined essence or purpose. We are constantly in the process of becoming through the choices we make. From this distinction arises Sartre's famous existentialist principle that existence precedes essence. This means that humans are not born with a built-in purpose, meaning, or nature. Instead, we first exist and then create who we are through our actions. Objects like a knife are designed with a specific essence or purpose to cut. Humans, however, have no such preordained blueprint. We are thrust into existence and are free to define ourselves, even though this freedom can be unsettling and overwhelming. Sartre uses consciousness as the key to understanding this difference. Consciousness is not a thing like other objects. It is a process of flow and ongoing activity of perceiving and relating to the world. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. It has no content or substance of its own, but is defined by its engagement with the external world. This outward directed nature of consciousness means that humans are always in a relationship with the world around them, shaping it through interpretation and action, while also being shaped by it. This leads to Sartre's rejection of deterministic views of human nature. If we are pure being for itself, then we are not bound by a fixed nature or divine plan. We are free, but this freedom is not optional. It is a fundamental aspect of existence. Even refusing to make choices is itself a choice, meaning we cannot escape responsibility for who we become. Sartre emphasizes that we are condemned to be free, meaning freedom is an unavoidable part of being human. There is no external authority or cosmic rulebook to dictate our purpose, leaving us alone to define it for ourselves. Throughout this opening section of Being and Nothingness, Sartre builds the framework for understanding human existence as a constant interplay between being in itself and being for itself. We live in a world of objects, yet we are not objects ourselves. We are conscious beings capable of reflection, imagination, and change, always aware of possibilities beyond the present reality. This dynamic makes human life uniquely unstable. We are never fully complete, and there is always a gap between what we are now and what we might become. This tension between being in itself and being for itself lays the groundwork for the rest of Sartre's philosophy. It introduces themes of freedom, responsibility, and nothingness, which he expands on in later sections of the book. Consciousness is not a passive mirror of reality, but an active force that shapes meaning and existence itself. The first part of Being and Nothingness thus establishes the essential difference between non-conscious things that simply are, and conscious beings who must constantly define themselves through their choices in an indifferent, purposeless universe. In the second major section of Being and Nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre introduces one of his most profound and challenging ideas: nothingness. For Sartre, nothingness is not a mystical or abstract concept, but a real and central feature of human consciousness. It is what makes freedom possible and what differentiates humans from objects. While being in itself, objects, simply exists without question or choice, being for itself, conscious beings, has an inherent gap or emptiness within it. This gap, this ability to step back from being and question it, is what Sartre calls nothingness. Nothingness first appears in human experience through negation, the ability to say no or to recognize that something is not as expected. Sartre illustrates this with an example of going to meet a friend named Pierre at a cafe. When he arrives and Pierre is not there, Sartre experiences Pierre's absence. This absence is not a physical thing. There is no object representing Pierre not being there, yet it shapes his experience of the cafe. Nothingness, in this sense, is introduced by consciousness. The world does not inherently contain negations, it simply is. Consciousness creates negation by imagining alternatives and possibilities, allowing humans to see what is missing or what could be different. This capacity for negation is what separates humans from the static, fixed being of objects. From this insight, Sartre builds his theory of freedom. Because humans are not determined by any fixed essence, and because they can imagine different possibilities for themselves, they are radically free. Consciousness is not bound by the present reality. It can always envision what is not yet, what is missing, or what could be. This ability to step outside the given situation and consider alternatives is what makes choice possible. We are never entirely defined by our past or by external conditions, because at any moment we can choose to act differently, to change course to negate the current state of affairs. However, Sartre emphasizes that this freedom is not always experienced as a gift or a comfort. It often feels like a burden. Freedom means there are no predetermined rules or external authorities to guide our choices. We are wholly responsible for defining ourselves, for giving meaning to our lives, and for facing the consequences of our actions. This can lead to feelings of anguish, the deep anxiety that arises when we recognize the weight of our freedom and the lack of any ultimate foundation for our choices. Sartre writes that humans are condemned to be free because even though we did not choose to exist, once we are here, we cannot escape the fact that we must choose and define ourselves through our actions. Nothingness also underlies the phenomenon of temporality, the way humans experience time. Objects simply exist in time. They are what they are in every moment. But humans experience time as an open horizon of possibilities. We project ourselves into the future, imagining what we might become, while also reflecting on our past actions and choices. This temporal nature of consciousness creates a constant tension between what we are now and what we strive to be. We are never fixed or complete. We live in a state of perpetual becoming, haunted by the nothingness of what is not yet realized. Sartre points out that even inaction is a choice. If we refuse to decide, refuse to take responsibility for shaping our lives, this refusal itself becomes a choice for which we are responsible. There is no escaping freedom because consciousness cannot help but project itself toward possibilities. The only alternative would be to become an object, a being in itself, but as long as we are conscious, this is impossible. We are always free, even when we deny or try to flee from that freedom. This section also introduces the idea that humans live in a constant state of lack. Because we are not complete beings with a fixed essence, we always feel that something is missing, that we are not yet fully what we could be. This feeling drives our projects, goals, and ambitions. We strive to fill this gap, to become whole, but Sartre argues that complete fulfillment is impossible because consciousness is defined by its openness to new possibilities. Once one goal is achieved, new ones emerge. Our being is characterized by this endless movement toward what we are not yet. Sartre also explores how nothingness allows humans to separate themselves from their facticity, the given aspects of their existence, such as their past, their social situation, their body, and circumstances of birth. While these factors shape us, they do not fully determine us. Consciousness can always question, reinterpret, and transcend them through choice. A person born into poverty is not absolutely defined by it. They retain the capacity to imagine and strive toward a different future. This freedom is never absolute. External conditions impose limits, but Sartre maintains that within those limits there is always the possibility of choosing how to respond, of giving meaning to one's situation. In sum, the second part of Being and Nothingness establishes nothingness as the essential structure of human consciousness, the basis for freedom, and the source of both our anxiety and our potential for self-creation. Unlike objects that are fully determined, humans live with a fundamental openness, a gap, between what we are and what we could be. This nothingness is not a defect, but the very condition that makes freedom and choice possible. It is what allows us to negate reality, imagine alternatives, and project ourselves into the future, even though this same freedom can overwhelm us with uncertainty and anguish. In this third major section of Being and Nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre examines one of the most striking consequences of human freedom, the tendency to flee from it. While freedom is an inescapable condition of our existence, it is often uncomfortable or even terrifying. We have no predetermined essence, no divine plan dictating who we should be, and no ultimate authority to give our lives meaning. This radical freedom also means that we alone are responsible for defining ourselves through our actions. Confronted with this responsibility and the anxiety it produces, humans often fall into what Sartre calls bad faith, a form of self-deception in which we try to deny or escape the truth of our freedom. Bad faith is not the same as an ordinary lie. In lying, a person knows the truth and consciously tries to deceive someone else. In bad faith, a person lies to themselves, convincing themselves that they are not as free as they really are, or that their actions are determined by external factors beyond their control. It is a kind of self-imposed illusion meant to avoid the anguish that comes with absolute freedom and responsibility. However, this deception is never entirely convincing, because on some level we are always aware of the freedom we are trying to deny. Sartre gives several examples to illustrate bad faith. One famous example is that of a waiter who is overly absorbed in his role. The waiter moves with mechanical precision, speaks in exaggeratedly polite tones, and behaves as though he is nothing more than a waiter, as though his entire existence is defined by this social role. Sartre argues that the waiter is engaging in bad faith because he is pretending to be an object, a being in itself with a fixed nature, when in fact he is a conscious being with the freedom to choose who he wants to be beyond this role. By acting as though his identity is fully determined by his job, he avoids facing the responsibility of defining himself through free choice. Another example involves interpersonal relationships, particularly in matters of love and seduction. A woman on a date might ignore or refuse to acknowledge her companion's flirtatious advances, pretending not to notice his intentions. By doing so, she avoids making a choice, either accepting or rejecting his proposal, and instead tries to suspend her freedom. acting as though no decision is required of her. Similarly, a man might pursue a romantic relationship while pretending that his feelings are pure and detached, when in fact there is a physical desire he chooses to ignore. These examples show how bad faith allows people to postpone or deny the reality of their freedom, masking it under social conventions, roles, or pretenses. Sartre emphasizes that bad faith is a universal and recurring temptation, not an occasional mistake. Because freedom is unsettling, humans constantly seek ways to avoid facing it fully. We tell ourselves stories that make our lives feel determined by nature, by society, by our past, by fate, or even by divine will. We convince ourselves that we had no choice in making a decision, or that we are victims of circumstance, or that we are defined completely by our roles and relationships. Yet, according to Sartre, these are illusions. Even under oppressive conditions or strict social rules, there remains a space for choice, at the very least, the choice of how to interpret and respond to the situation. Bad faith is the refusal to acknowledge this space. At the heart of bad faith is a contradiction in human existence. Sartre says that humans are a synthesis of facticity and transcendence. Facticity refers to the fixed aspects of our existence, our body, our past, our social context, and other facts that are given and unchangeable at a given moment. Transcendence refers to our ability to surpass these facts, to imagine new possibilities, to define ourselves beyond what is given. Bad faith occurs when we try to reduce ourselves entirely to facticity, pretending we are nothing more than what circumstances have made us, or entirely to transcendence, pretending we are pure freedom, unaffected by the past or physical reality. In truth, we are both. We are situated beings bound by certain facts, yet never fully determined by them, because we always retain the power to choose our attitude and future actions. Bad faith also appears in the way people approach moral rules or social expectations. Many try to use external standards as an escape from freedom, claiming that they act a certain way because it is required by duty, tradition, or the law. Sartre argues that even here, freedom is unavoidable, because choosing to obey a rule is itself an act of freedom. We choose to accept the rule as valid and binding, meaning that we remain responsible for the choice to submit to it. Thus, there is no way to shift responsibility for our actions onto something outside ourselves, not God, not society, not fate. To believe otherwise is bad faith. The concept of bad faith reveals how fragile and uneasy human freedom is. On the one hand, Sartre insists that we are absolutely free. No external force determines our essence. On the other hand, this absolute freedom is difficult to bear. It creates a sense of groundlessness and anxiety, pushing us to hide from it behind excuses, roles, or false identities. Bad faith is an attempt to become like an object, to fix our being and escape the uncertainty of self-creation. Yet this escape can never succeed because consciousness cannot stop being free. We can pretend that we are defined by our circumstances, but deep down we know that we are the ones choosing how to respond to them. This section of Being and Nothingness shows how self-deception is woven into human life. Sartre does not present bad faith as a moral failing in the traditional sense, but as an existential condition, a constant temptation that arises because the truth of our freedom is both undeniable and deeply unsettling. The challenge of authentic existence, which Sartre will explore further in later parts of the book, is to live without bad faith, to acknowledge our freedom fully, accept responsibility for our actions, and create meaning without hiding behind illusions of determinism or fixed identity. But as Sartre suggests, this is one of the most difficult challenges of human life. In this section of Being and Nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre shifts focus from individual consciousness to human relationships. While the earlier parts of the book explore being in itself, being for itself, nothingness, and bad faith, this part examines how our freedom and identity are shaped and often threatened by the existence of other conscious beings. Sartre introduces the concept of being for others, the mode of existence that arises when we become aware that we are objects in someone else's field of consciousness. This awareness transforms how we experience ourselves, often creating conflict, shame, and struggles for control. Sartre illustrates this idea with his famous example of the look. Imagine someone peeking through a keyhole, completely absorbed in the act of spying on another person. In this state, the person is pure subjectivity. They are focused outward, entirely caught up in their project, not thinking about themselves. Suddenly, they hear footsteps behind them and realize that someone else sees them watching through the keyhole. In that instant, their experience of themselves changes. They no longer feel like a free subject fully engaged in their own activity, but instead become aware that they are an object in someone else's gaze. They imagine how the other person sees them, as a voyeur, as someone doing something shameful or sneaky. This experience produces feelings like shame, pride, or embarrassment, showing that our awareness of others fundamentally alters how we relate to ourselves. For Sartre, this moment captures a basic truth about human relationships. The presence of another consciousness introduces a kind of alienation. On our own, we experience ourselves as free, as beings for itself, who define our existence through choice. But in the presence of others, we are also defined from the outside, turned into objects in their world, subject to their judgment and interpretation. Our self-awareness is no longer purely our own. It is mediated by how we imagine others see us. This is the essence of being for others. This dynamic creates inherent tension in human relationships. On one hand, we seek recognition from others. We want them to see and affirm our freedom and individuality. On the other hand, their gaze threatens our freedom because it pins us down, defining us in ways we may not choose for ourselves. Sartre argues that relationships are often shaped by a struggle for dominance, a conflict over who gets to assert themselves as a free subject and who is reduced to an object. Love, desire, and even friendship can become battlegrounds where people try to control or possess the freedom of the other while preserving their own. Sartre examines love as an example of this paradoxical relationship. In love, a person desires not just physical closeness, but also a deeper kind of validation. They want the other person to freely choose to love them. Love aims at possessing the other's freedom in a way that is impossible. If someone's affection is forced or manipulated, it loses its authenticity. But if it is given freely, it cannot be fully possessed or guaranteed. This tension often leads to frustration and conflict, as lovers oscillate between wanting to be completely desired and wanting the other's freedom to remain intact. Sartre suggests that the pursuit of love often becomes a subtle struggle to make oneself the center of another's universe without losing their voluntary devotion. Similarly, sexual desire illustrates the push and pull between subjectivity and objectification. In desire, there is an attempt to unite with another person, to bridge the gap between self and other. But this attempt often fails because it involves turning the other person into an object of pleasure, while at the same time wanting them to remain a free, conscious subject. This contradiction makes human intimacy fraught with ambiguity, as we vacillate between treating others as independent beings and as objects of our own projects. Even seemingly neutral social encounters are shaped by this dynamic of the gaze. For example, social roles such as boss and employee or teacher and student impose ways of seeing and being seen that limit individual freedom. We internalize the judgments of others, often behaving in ways that conform to their expectations. Sartre sees this as another form of bad faith, where people allow themselves to be defined entirely by how others see them, forgetting that they still have the freedom to choose how to interpret and respond to these judgments. Conflict becomes a fundamental aspect of relationships because each consciousness wants to assert itself as a free subject while resisting being reduced to an object. Sartre famously writes that hell is other people, not to say that all relationships are doomed, but to emphasize that the presence of others inevitably challenges our sense of self. We are thrown into a constant negotiation between freedom and objectification, between defining ourselves and being defined by someone else. Despite this tension, Sartre does not claim that relationships are hopeless. Rather, they are marked by an inescapable ambiguity. True recognition of another person's freedom is possible, but extremely fragile, as it requires allowing them to exist as a subject without trying to control or possess them. Likewise, authentic relationships require acknowledging that we are never fully in control of how others see us, yet we remain responsible for how we engage with them. The challenge is to navigate this complex interplay of freedom, vulnerability, and the gaze of others without succumbing entirely to domination, submission, or bad faith. This part of Being and Nothingness deepens Sartre's exploration of human existence by showing that we do not experience our freedom in isolation. Other people are integral to our lives, shaping our identities and choices in profound ways. The gaze of the other reveals aspects of ourselves we cannot ignore, but it also threatens to fix us in roles we may not choose. Relationships, then, are not purely sources of connection and comfort. They are also arenas of conflict, exposure, and struggle for authentic recognition. In the final section of Being and Nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre brings together the major themes he has explored throughout the book: consciousness, nothingness, bad faith, relationships, and freedom. This conclusion focuses on what it ultimately means to exist as a human being, fully aware of our radical freedom, our responsibility for defining ourselves, and the limits imposed by the world and other people. Sartre's final reflections are both liberating and unsettling, as they challenge traditional notions of morality, purpose, and identity. At the heart of Sartre's philosophy is the claim that human beings are condemned to be free. This phrase captures the paradox of existence. We did not choose to be born, yet once we exist, we cannot escape the fact that we must make choices. There is no divine plan, no natural essence, and no fixed meaning that determines who we are or what we should do. Every moment of our lives is a decision, whether active or passive, deliberate or unconscious. Even refusing to act or submitting to external rules or pressures is itself a choice for which we remain responsible. There is no escaping this fundamental freedom, and with it comes an equally unavoidable responsibility. Sartre argues that this responsibility is absolute. Each person is wholly responsible for their actions and, more profoundly, for who they become through those actions. We cannot blame fate, biology, society, or God for what we are, because while these factors shape our situation, they do not dictate how we respond to it. Our existence is a project, an ongoing process of defining ourselves through free choices in the face of an indifferent universe. Sartre insists that we create our own values through action, meaning there is no pre-existing moral order to rely on. Morality is not given but made, and each person bears the weight of constructing it for themselves and, implicitly, for humanity as a whole. This recognition leads to a form of existential anguish, not merely fear or anxiety about particular situations, but a deeper realization that we are free without ultimate guidance. Anguish emerges when we see that every choice we make not only defines us but also expresses what we believe a human being ought to be. Our decisions project an image of humanity, setting examples and shaping the world around us. Because nothing guarantees that our choices are right or justified, we live with a constant sense of uncertainty and vulnerability. Yet this anguish is not a flaw of existence. It is the mark of true freedom. Many people try to escape this burden through bad faith, convincing themselves that their lives are predetermined or defined by external rules. Others seek solace in religion, tradition, or societal norms that promise ready-made meanings. Sartre does not deny that these frameworks can guide action, but he insists that choosing to follow them is still a free decision. There is no escape from responsibility, because even obedience is an act of freedom. We cannot transfer the weight of our choices onto fate, divine will, or human nature. As Sartre famously says, man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Despite its heavy tone, Sartre's conclusion is not purely pessimistic. If life has no inherent meaning, this does not condemn us to despair. It frees us to create meaning. We are not bound by destiny or fixed essence, which means that within the constraints of our circumstances, we can choose who we want to. B. Existence is an open horizon of possibilities, limited only by the facts of our situation and the freedom of others. This creative power is what makes human life dynamic and unique. We are works in progress, perpetually shaping ourselves through choices that define our essence. However, freedom is never exercised in isolation. We exist among other conscious beings whose freedom intersects with ours. As explored in the previous section, the gaze of others can limit or challenge our freedom, attempting to fix us into an objectified identity. Similarly, our actions inevitably affect the freedom of others. Sartre argues that authentic existence requires acknowledging both our own freedom and that of others, without trying to escape responsibility or dominate the freedom of those around us. While the book does not fully develop a positive ethical system, it suggests that a genuine respect for the freedom of others is essential to living authentically. Sartre concludes being and nothingness with a stark rejection of determinism, divine design, or any external source of meaning. Existence precedes essence, and life is a blank canvas upon which we must paint our identity and values. This vision is both daunting and empowering. It strips away comforting illusions of fate or preordained purpose, leaving us face to face with the fact that meaning is not given, but created. The task of human existence is to take ownership of this freedom, to live without self-deception, and to assume full responsibility for what we make of ourselves and the world. In the end, Sartre does not offer a final solution to the dilemmas of freedom, bad faith, and the conflict with others. Instead, being and nothingness leaves us with a challenge to embrace the truth of our condition without fleeing into false certainties, to act with awareness of our freedom and its weight, and to accept that we alone are the authors of our lives. This existential stance demands courage, honesty, and creativity, as it asks us to construct meaning in a universe that provides none on its own. For Sartre, this is both the burden and the glory of being human, to live authentically in a world of nothingness, continually choosing and creating who we are. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the pages of another thought-provoking book. If you enjoyed this summary and want more deep, mindful insights into powerful reads, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Mindful Reads, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep your mind open to new ideas.